Once again, I wish you Shana Tova, a good yard. Once, Abraham was fussing with his PC when Isaac wandered past. "What you doing, Pop?" he asked. Abraham said, "I'm trying to load Windows 10 on my old laptop." "It'll never work," Isaac replied. "You don't have enough memory on that thing." "Don't worry, my son," Abraham said. "God will provide the RAM." All right. Give me a thumbs up if that's a good joke. So. I don't have any Abraham Zoom jokes, so that one will have to do. In our Torah reading this morning, we read the frightful, disturbing story of Akedat Yitzchak. Today, I'm not interested in the typical questions of how a moral God could demand such a thing. We'll leave that for another time. Neither am I interested in how a father could possibly sacrifice his son. To know how such a thing is possible, one only needs to meet a father and a son isolated together for 7 months because of a pandemic. Instead, I want to focus on the Jewish concept of what's called zchut avot. Zchut means merit or privilege. Avot means ancestors. So zchut avot is the idea that the merit of one generation can benefit a later generation. Think about it like setting up a trust fund. The good deeds of my ancestors are credited to me, to my account, which I can withdraw as needed. Their merit offers me privilege. And Akedat Yitzchak, this story, is really the paradigmatic example in Jewish thought of this concept. Now, we've heard a lot about privilege in this past year, specifically in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the riots for the protests for racial justice. There's been a lot of discussion around white privilege. And so I'd like to discuss how the Jewish concept of zchut avot might inform our understanding of privilege, and how the contemporary critique of privilege might inform Jewish theology. As I begin, I want to acknowledge the obvious. As a white man, I have different associations with and understanding of the concept of privilege than people of color, including Jews of color with us today. I also want to say that I find some of this learning challenging. It requires time and patience, openness and vulnerability. That's okay, because to be a Jew is to be one who wrestles with ideas, wrestles with oneself and with God. Back to our story. In the Torah, God seems quite upset with God seems quite pleased with Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. God promises to bestow blessings upon Abraham, as David Esrom just read, on Abraham's descendants because, as it says, he didn't withhold his favorite son. Now, in the Musaf Amidah, which will follow this sermon, we remind God of that promise and ask God to show us mercy, saying, quote, "You made a covenant with Jacob, with Isaac, and with Abraham. V'zacharti et briti Yaakov, af et briti Yitzchak, af et briti Abraham." So did you notice that the order of the patriarchs is reversed? Jacob, Isaac, Abraham. Why is that? Rashi answers, because if Jacob's merit was insufficient to elicit your compassion, God, then rely on Isaac's. And if Isaac's would be insufficient, God, then surely you can rely on Abraham's merit, for he was willing to sacrifice his only son. Well, you can hear in this petition the concept of zchut avot. We rely on Abraham's merit to help us gain favor before God. It's a way of saying that I have yichus. I'm a descendant of Abraham. So pay attention to me, God. Hear my prayer. This idea is actually not exclusive to the high holidays. We invoke the merit of our ancestors 3 times a day when we pray, Eloheinu, Elohei Avoteinu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. But it's particularly important today when we seek to tip the scales of justice. We admit Ki ein banu ma'asim. God, we have no worthy deeds. Therefore, we call on Abraham's merit to count in our favor. In modern Hebrew, we'd say that we're using protexia. In today's terms, we call it privilege. Now, I have to be honest and say that until recently, I never really thought much about privilege. When I was a kid, my parents made it clear that staying up late, that was a privilege reserved for special occasions. Going on a family vacation, on a trip, that was a privilege. So I understood that privileges were wonderful things that I had to earn. Later, I learned that privilege can mean receiving the benefit of the doubt or having access, entree, opportunity. All those are good things. But I've been learning that it's more than that. This summer's racial protests really awakened many of us to the hard truths that we have overlooked or ignored. That is, that privilege is when you think something is not a problem because it's not a problem for you. I'll say that again. Privilege is when you think that something is not a problem because it's not your problem. Now, in many discussions and conversations that follow the protests, I've come to understand more about white privilege. One conversation in particular with a classmate of mine, Eli Garfinkel, helped me think about it in this way. White privilege means that if I'm ever pulled over by the police for speeding, I'm afraid what my wife will say, but not afraid what the police will do. White privilege means that no one dares question if my life matters. White privilege means that if I'm ever turned down for a job, it's not going to be because of race. White privilege means that if my kid doesn't get into Harvard, no one will, if my kid gets into Harvard, no one will sneer and say, affirmative action. White privilege means that when I look out and see American institutions, I am filled with pride, even though there are things about which we should be ashamed. These and other examples reveal the dark side of privilege in America. When it comes to race, too often my advantage goes hand in hand with someone else's disadvantage. Now, let me pause here and acknowledge that privilege is a loaded word. Being called privileged might imply that you didn't work hard, and that's not necessarily true. Being privileged might make some feel guilty or ashamed or judged, and that's not particularly helpful. Instead, my point in speaking about the topic this morning is, just on a most basic level, to simply have us take note. Ijeoma Oluo, in her book, So You Want to Talk About Race, writes, when somebody asks you to check your privilege, they're asking you to pause and to consider the advantages you've had in life, that they're contributing to your opinions and actions, and how the lack of disadvantages prevents you from fully understanding the struggles others are facing. Awareness is a critical first step because, as Oluo says, unexamined privilege inflicts pain on others. And on these high holidays, when we benefit from privilege, when we work hard to try to undo harm, to repair damage that we inflicted on others, we're challenged to examine privilege. And long after these chagim, we should keep on learning, listening to people of color, reading books about racism, look for those opportunities through Bethel's Social Justice Committee and other community organizations. Awareness, of course, is important, but it alone is not enough. Our learning must lead to doing. We are to be a shofar, to use our influence to combat systemic racism. In the words of Senator John Lewis, if you see something that's not right, that's not fair, you have a moral obligation to do something about it. I've shared with you before one of my favorite verses in the Torah. It's a verse about making offerings at the temple, but its lessons go far beyond that. Ish k'matnat yado k'virchat Hashem Elohecha asher natan lach, which means that each person is called upon to give according to the blessings that they've been given. In other words, those with much are expected to give much. Those with less are asked to give less. When it comes to racism, those with privilege are called upon to use it to open doors and dismantle systems that turn our advantage, my advantage, into another person's disadvantage. Because when it comes to healthcare, excellence in education, treatment by the police, and more, privilege should not be a factor. Now, you might look out and feel like, I don't really have a lot of privilege. You might not make a lot of money. You might not be a social media influencer with thousands of followers. You might not have political connections, but each of us has something to give. Each of us is called upon to use our power and influence to level the playing field. Ish kamatnat yado. Each person, whether they have a lot or a little, is called upon to do their part. In the best of Jewish tradition, therefore, privilege doesn't mean advantage over others. It means responsibility for them. As we say, Ratzah HaKadosh Baruch Hu lizachot et Yisrael, lechen hirba lehem Torah u'mitzvot. God wanted to give a zchut, to give merit to the Jewish people, so God gave us an abundance of Torah and mitzvot. In other words, from a Jewish perspective, privilege implies duty. In that sense, I'm challenged by an aspect of zchut havot. If zchut havot is understood as an unearned benefit that we inherit from our ancestors, it could breed complacency, because we could ride on the coattails of our ancestors. And the problem, of course, is if we pass on privilege to the next generation without expecting them to earn it, then we foster a sense of entitlement. Not surprisingly, this concern has been raised about zchut havot ever since zchut havot has been around. It was first mentioned as an idea by a first century BCE, by a sage named Shemaiah. Shemaiah taught that the Israelites were saved from the Egyptians at the Red Sea because of the merit of Abraham Avinu, of Abraham. His colleague, Avtalion, said, no. He disagreed and said, it's because of their own merit. Well, in good Jewish fashion, I believe we should say, you're right, and you're right. Following Avtalion, we should not rely on privilege to pave our way. We must earn it. As the Midrash says, let not a man say, my father was pious, I shall be saved for his sake. On the other hand, following Shemaiah, let us acknowledge with humility that we're not self-made. We've been shaped by those who came before us, by all that surrounds us and supports us. In the words of a different Midrash, the people Israel are compared to a grapevine. Just as the vine grows, leaning on dead branches, so Israel is supported by our ancestors. And this brings us back to Avraham and Yitzchak. God willing, none of us will ever be called upon to sacrifice our children. But I would venture a guess that all of us are willing to sacrifice for our children, and we would do so willingly, out of love. On these high holidays, as we examine our lives and consider our privilege, we're asked, what do you want to leave your children, your loved ones, when you're gone? And what do you have to do to make that happen? There are the material things that we want to pass on: cabin, family heirlooms, and inheritance. Those are wonderful. And then there are the eternal, spiritual things: community that embraces them, hallowed traditions that ground them, sacred values that guide them. It's up to us to pass on material and spiritual gifts to the next generation. We do so by working hard, by saving, by investing. We do so by living lives of holiness, by pursuing justice, by performing good deeds. Yes, these things will benefit our children, but we do them just because it's the right thing to do. Yes, these things will be counted in our favor, but our purpose is not self-aggrandizement. It's to teach our children and inspire them by our example. It's up to us to work, to grow, to change, that they might inherit a world in which privilege does not come with a price, but carries responsibility. A world in which they and all people can thrive, for we have made a difference. A world of health, of abundance, of joy and peace. And Omar, Amen.